David experienced the consequences of his sin. And by the way, everybody will. Everybody thinks they're going to be the exception to the rule. Oh, David didn't get away with it, but I'll get away with it. No, you won't. No, you won't. You see, there are always devastating consequences to our decision to sin. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 12. Go to next chapter over. You're in chapter 11. Go to chapter 12. Look, please, at verse 11. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this sun. For thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. And David said unto Nathan, that is the prophet, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, The Lord also hath put away thy sin, thou shalt not die. Howbeit, and notice, there will be consequences. The penalty of sin, the wages of death is what? Death. Or the wages of sin is death. Let me get it right. Now, notice though, he says, you're not going to die. Howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also that is born unto thee shall surely die. There were both immediate consequences to David's sin, and then there were what I would call delayed or long-term consequences, all for a few moments of pleasure. David paid dearly for yielding to the lust of his flesh. His baby died. His beautiful daughter Tamar was raped by her half-brother Amnon. Amnon was murdered by Tamar's full brother Absalom. Absalom came to hate his father David so much that he led a coup or a rebellion against him. David's concubines were humiliated publicly by Absalom whenever he captured the kingdom. For the rest of David's life, he experienced one tragedy after another, either in his family or in his kingdom. He paid a high price for a few moments of passion with his neighbor's wife. If David was standing here right now on this platform, I believe he would say, it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it. I believe also he would quote to you the verse in Numbers 32 and verse 23, and be sure your sin will find you out. You'll not get away with sin. David probably thought since he was the king, he could do whatever he wanted to do. He would get away with it. What he forgot was that he was accountable to God. And God saw his sin, and God dealt severely with that sin in David's life. What is God's will for our lives? I want you to look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We've been in the Old Testament. I want you to go to the New Testament just for a moment. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 3. I have no idea what time it is because I didn't bring a watch this morning. And all God's people said, oh no. All right. And I don't see a clock up here, so when the notes run out, we'll be done. Okay? Don't tell me what time it is. I don't want to know that. That was a question that was not meant to be answered. All right? 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 3. For this is what? The will of God. Even your sanctification, which has all to do with living a holy life, that ye should abstain from fornication. You are to abstain from sexual immorality. Be committed to this biblical principle. You see that verse? Be committed to that. Our culture will read a verse like that and laugh. Huh? They don't think this is true at all. They don't even care about God. They don't care about His Word. They don't care about God's will. They don't care about any of that. But 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 3, we as God's people, we ought to set up and we ought to take note of what Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is saying to us here. For this is the will of God. He doesn't say this might be the will of God for some of you. No, he says this is the will of God for all of you. Even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from fornication or sexual immorality. Be committed to this biblical principle. Discipline yourself to abstain from all sexual immorality. Discipline yourself to live a pure and holy life. Discipline yourself to think pure thoughts. Let me encourage you to be wise enough and discerning enough to establish some boundaries in your life and in your marriage that will protect your relationship with your spouse against sexual immorality. And by the way, those boundaries need to be established before you are ever confronted with temptation. If you are tempted and you don't have boundaries already established, you are easy prey for Satan. Establish the boundaries. Turn the other way. Train yourself to be self-controlled men who become men of character. Don't pretend to be a man of character when you're constantly looking back at that temptation. Have enough discipline. Train yourself. It may not come natural, but train yourself to turn the other way. Job said in chapter 31, verse 1, I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? Now notice eyes and then what? Thinking. Once again, that connection there. What we look at and what we stare at, eventually we begin to think about it. And he said, I've made a covenant. I've made a promise with my eyes. I'm not going to stare and look at a young woman lustfully. But he said what? Why then should I think upon a maid? I'm asking you today to value sexual purity in your marriage. There's not going to be a whole lot of preachers to get up behind their pulpits and talk about this subject. There won't be. But I believe it's a very, very important subject for every person here, no matter how long you've been married and no matter how old you are today. You've got to guard sexual purity in your marriage. You say, how do I do that? There could be many practical ways, but I want to give you two spiritual ways. Number one, strengthen your relationship and your love for God. Strengthen your relationship with God and your love for Him. Number two, strengthen your relationship and love for your spouse. Those are two ways that you can protect your marriage from sexual immorality.